start the story off here. You're going to think the flood story, I'm going to talk about the earlier floods and the hydrology, and I'm not going to bore people with geologic data and hydrology. I'm going to start with the steel mill in about 1900 and 1901 to 1904. And the modern city that existed in Pueblo in 1921 was in a large part a result of a huge economic boom. The steel mill had hired about 2,000 people between like 1901 and 1904, and it's actually probably more after that. And if you can think about an employer coming, Vestas came to town and hired 300 to 500 people, and that was a big deal. And so our town was a magnitude smaller, and they hired 2,000 people. And so Bessemer couldn't handle that. People spread out into the east side, into the north side. The trolley system had already developed, but it had expanded, and so people were commuting from all over the city to go to the steel mill. And so Pueblo had already been a city, they'd already been doing fairly well, but it's this impulse of energy in the early 1900s that really created this boom in Pueblo that wasn't necessarily felt all over the West. And here's my other favorite photo, I think, of Pueblo. And so you move into we could have presentations all day talking about Pueblo in the 1880s and 1890s. And so I wanted to fast forward to the progressive era. And that's one thing that's going to run through this whole presentation was the progressive era and the end of the progressive era. And you kind of in a nutshell, the progressive era was this move in American society at all different levels, especially sociologically, really to end the corruption of the Gilded Age, the robber barons, and people were fed up with it. They were done with corruption. They were public health had just come on the scene. They wanted things to be cleaner, literally, in their government, and they wanted to fight disease that had claimed so many lives. And they were trying to respond to industrialization and really bad working conditions. So there was this kind of buoyancy, especially in Pueblo, that with just sheer determination and will, we could really conquer anything, and we could make everything better. And so that really manifested itself in civic life and public health, as well as the built environment. And so this slide is one of my favorite. I don't have a date for it, but the little bowler hats, then the police and people are in, cars and trolleys are both kind of going together. So it's probably late aughts, teens, early teens maybe. And it's the Congress Hotel. And the thing I want to talk about by the 1910, we were already sort of on our second wave of buildings. And we think of our historic buildings in Pueblo. And 1870 is when we became a city, before we became a state. And we had early buildings in 1870, and those were wood framed and adobe. But by 1904, concrete had become, we kind of take concrete for granted. That wasn't around when Pueblo started. And better brick technology had come out. So we were already knocking these old antiquated buildings that were from the 1870s and 1880s down in 1904 and 1910. And so this is the Congress Hotel. The one on the left is kind of like a Second Empire, the earlier version. And this is the spanking new mission style. People are already kind of looking to the West, even though we were in the West. They were looking to California. And it just shows kind of the life that was going on. I really haven't found a better photo that just kind of shows like just general like exuberancy and kind of around the teens period or transitional. And if anybody went to Adam's talk last night, they're talking about the progressive era and kind of this attitude. And you saw it in Chicago with the World's Fair, and then you saw it in Denver with Mayor Spear and all the boulevards they did. There was this idea that the city had to look different. We had to become, even though we were still relying on our industrial base, we had to become this pure kind of white city in terms of purity and evoke a lot of Greece and Rome. And so I asked Maria to send me the pulp directories. Those are things that are still put out. And you can go back and find the addresses and where people lived and things like that. But before the internet, that's the way you probably would have had other copies of those in Chicago from Pueblo. And if you wanted to find somebody, you went through the pulp directory. So there was always this PR campaign in the front of the pulp directory. I love it because it would show pictures and say, look at these beautiful buildings. And it was, nothing bad ever happened in the town from the people who wrote the pulp directories. And I thought this was so perfect. This is 1919, so this is 2 years before the flood. So this is kind of the tail end of the progressive era, but I just put the whole thing in here. I don't necessarily read it all, but it talks about younger cities coming of and I'd been working on this presentation trying to get this idea across that Pueblo was already rebuilding itself for this new city that was coming up. The Wild West was dying, the Wild West Pueblo, and now the modern, industrial, clean, progressive Pueblo is being built. And they got this great quote, and then somebody used architectural pluritude. So I had to, everybody uses that when they're talking, I told my wife she was pluritude, I got slapped in the face, but, actually it just means architectural beauty, civic beauty, and it actually said Pueblo is being rebuilt. The business center is going a pleasant transformation, and that means that we're tearing down historic buildings and putting up new ones. Too large, and the high schools have been built. The courthouse had just been constructed a couple years ago, and City Hall was in the middle of its rebuilding. And so, and then also they talked about street improvements of a permanent character are underway. And so I wanted to kind of talk to people, just take a lot for granted. In 1919, 1920, the Mesa paving district had just been finished. So they just finished paving the streets in Mesa. 1904, they had done a street in Bessemer. 1906, they had done Main Street. But most of the streets in the city were not paved, except for a couple of main corridors. And so they were just getting Mesa done. It's kind of interesting they had the south side done before the north side. But after the flood, they would go into the north side and the east side. But I thought this was a great way, like the Pueblo was trying to sell itself as this kind of rebuilding city. And I found this a long time ago, and I've always kept it, and I knew I'd be able to use it someplace. But this is 1909, and we talk about the City Beautiful movement, and Adam talked about last night the Chicago's World Fair in 1893, which was probably the single most resonant event that happened in American architecture and planning and city design. And basically everybody came out of that World's Fair wanting to build Greek and Roman beautiful, clean boulevards, and everything is just beautiful. But there was a huge recession, and so nobody got to actually build this stuff until 1904, 1905. And then Pueblo even took a little bit longer, and so it took about 1909, but it took a little longer to get the city county courthouse built. But you just see Pueblo beautiful, talking about beauty, health, sunshine, prosperity. There's just this like go get 'em attitude. And here it again, 1938. And then where we are today, we take for granted libraries. 1903, 1904, we got libraries. Carnegie was wealthy enough to give everybody in America a library, basically. And so even though ours is sort of a Carnegie library, we kept McClellan, which is kind of interesting. And that's sat where we sit, and then another one was built, and now this one's built. So we're in the third round of libraries, and where we sit here. And so this idea of these historic cities that are unchanging is not true, and so Pueblo was already kind of in its next wave of modernization when the flood hit. And so I had a couple other slides. Here's commercial buildings Guggenheim block being built downtown. I mean, all these buildings would have had little commercial storefronts and brick buildings that have been torn down. There are probably a couple of vacant lots too. And the Vale Hotel, and so we had fireproof buildings now with these new concrete and brick and buildings weren't going to burn down anymore. And as we'll see, that didn't really hold up very well. But they at least sold everybody that concrete block buildings weren't going to burn down as easy. And just education was another thing, is that, we had a lot of immigrants. If we educated everybody, we all became American, everything would work out right. And so people put a lot of money. And so, we were really on par with other major cities in Denver building, Central High School. That Reichschlaub did. Reichschlaub is a famous architecture firm in Denver. They did the first iteration, and then Stickney ended up, after a fire, taking over the second round. So Central High School was going up, and so those are the modern buildings. And I'll go back here really quick. And this modern look was being very clean and pure and Greek, but the colors changed. And so all the buildings you see after 1900 are blonde brick, concrete. They're very white. There's not a lot of superfluous ornamentation, or as my other planner calls accessorizing. There's not a lot of architectural earrings on buildings after 1900, 1910. So you get very clean, austere, beautiful looking buildings. The idea was that local government was going to be clean and effective, and the buildings needed to say that too. And that added to this incredible building stock that we had, especially downtown, of I call them Victorian era buildings, kind of our first and second round of building. This would have been kind of like a first and a half round building. This is the Opera House, and this is a building that we lost shortly after the flood. But this, we go to the mall now. We go downtown. Everything was here. These buildings had activity is organized vertically instead of horizontally like it is now. So this was the Opera House. And as Adam talked about last night, in the 1890s, things weren't really separated. Nowadays, you might go to the bar to hear this type of band and the opera and the theater. It really all happened in the same building. And that's the opera, there would have been Wagner, there would have been vaudeville, there would have been all sorts of things. But there was also, the architect's office would have been here, and the lawyer, and maybe a banker. Everything would have happened and they were called blocks. And so there'd be the Opera House block, and there'd be the Central block. And this is a good slide to show the look before the City Beautiful movement. Was very Victorian, and it was kind of like orange brick and orange stone. A lot of it you see still at the depot is like a Manitou sandstone. And so, there's a lot of, this one, when you get up close, there's a lot of ornamentation. There's stone and brick, and there's, carvings in the building. And that's really left over from the Gilded Age, this time of wealth. And so you got wealth, and you wanted to show it with your house and with your buildings. And so you see the Thatcher Mansion, maybe not the best example, but a lot of Queen Anne houses. There's turrets and another turret, and there's an oriel, and there's this, and there's that. And people are really showing, like, look at my house. I've got a lot of wealth. You're a steel mill worker. You're living in a shack. And I've got this much more wealth than you. And so that a lot of that shows up on individual houses a little bit better, but commercial districts, you don't see an orange brick or you don't see an orange stone building going up after the progressive area. It's weird. It just became very dated very quickly. So hopefully you'll leave this and you can go downtown and you can basically tell if buildings are pre-progressive era or after. And then one of our favorite buildings that isn't around anymore, and people here who've lived here their whole life know about it, but Mineral Palace Park was started before the Chicago's World Fair, actually. It's probably inspired by some of the world's, Paris and some of the other expositions. But it was sort of an investment in a real estate gimmick, sort of, to get people to live in Pueblo and to live on the north side. And there would have been a lot of open space around this. We always see these pictures of the palace. We don't see what's behind. I wish somebody would have followed the famous photographers and just stood behind them and took pictures of what they weren't showing. As historians, that would be just as interesting as what they're showing. And so there was a lot of empty land around here. And so you can think about like Ventana or Pueblo West. Like you're trying to get people to come out and develop some place that to somebody from Chicago or New York is probably godforsaken arid desert. And so you build a park and you irrigate it and you build this building. But just like the Chicago buildings, it was built kind of staff and kind of plaster, and it really had problems right from the get-go. It really was meant as this exhibition hall, but it really kind of struggled right after it was built. And so those were fixed up by the WPA and taken down in the early 40s. But this, I don't think anybody knew at the time when they built it that it would play such a pivotal role in the flood and having open space. And then you get back to downtown Pueblo, and just kind of the scenes of what was going on at the trolley tracks. You had these streets are paved. This one you've got mostly cars. We still have a buggy in there, so things are transitioning. Here's another one with the trolley. And at Thatcher Block, I just want to put a picture of the Thatcher building, in 1912, 1913. And this would have really made Puebloans feel like they're part of a big city. And you look at this picture, and that could have been anywhere in Chicago. But the slides I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes show you that it was kind of an illusion. But this Thatcher Block was this was a 7-story building, office building that really was kind of pushing us into the skyscraper level. And so Pueblo is really interesting because there's very few cities that started the skyscraper era and stopped. And I think the Pueblo flood was part of it, and there's a bunch of other economic reasons. So I think just for that, we're kind of interesting that we're really like 2 to 3 stories with a couple of aberrant buildings in this area. And we love parades, or at least we love taking pictures of parades. People are very exuberant. There's lots and lots of pictures of parades. We really loved our downtown and our historic district that went down through there. But like I was saying before in that earlier quote, the streets weren't paved. This is a little bit later, in the 1930s, because people just didn't really think it was worth taking pictures of streets getting paved. But a lot of the streets wouldn't have been paved, have been dirt streets. In Pueblo, some neighborhoods stayed unpaved streets to the 60s and 70s. And this is from 1938, but I think it probably would have been the same if you just went a couple blocks. This is a couple blocks west, I think in 3rd Street in Greenwood. So you had this roaring downtown that looked like Chicago or New York. And I think the cool thing about Pueblo at the time would have been that you could just walk a couple blocks over and there'd still be a vacant lot. And we kind of wonder why we didn't maybe have more parks. And I think it's because kids just played in the landscape. And so the city really wasn't dense and built out in a lot of places. Maybe Bessemer was an exception, but a lot of the city still had vacant lots, and the trolley system was amazing. You could go anywhere, and then you're still in the prairie, and you could, or if you could afford it, you could go to Beulah. So we had this very urban scene, but what I want to show is that it wasn't all urban. You could get away from it very quickly, and that might have to do with why we didn't have some of the labor troubles that they did in other places. You could still kind of escape some of that in Pueblo. Another thing I wanted to talk about was we think of the flood, and this is, might be a slide that's better if I ever go give this someplace else, but the flood, we'll see in the map, it really devastated downtown. But by this time, a lot of the middle class housing subdivisions were out of the floodplain. They were in Mesa Junction, they were on the north side, they were on the east side. And so a lot of this new housing that was going on was completely unaffected by the flood. So, it's those first rung buildings. So a lot of our earliest, oldest historic buildings were the ones that were hit the hardest. And they were made out of adobe and wood frame, and they were the least likely to survive anything. So any of the buildings that we have in town that are 1870s, 1880s are really significant just for being around after all this. And the sewers, we never think about looking underground. How exciting is it to show sewer photographs? But I don't know where we had these. They're in the city collection, but we have all these 1938 photos, and then we have a whole bunch of 1904 photos of them putting in sanitary sewer and sanitary lines. And if you think about it, you might be really excited in 1908 or 1909 to live in a modern house with a bathroom inside the house. That was one thing I think kids especially have, and maybe some adults don't realize. That was a new thing coming was that you could go to the bathroom inside of your house. And so the layouts of houses actually changed. Victorian houses are different because they generally had outhouses. So 1904 they were finally 1904 up into up to 1921's things had extended quite a bit, but they were still extending the infrastructure. So it was difficult to live in the Far East Side because you'd actually have to extend the line, or you had to wait till the line be extended. And somebody told me a story about an adobe house they built in the East Side 1940s, and their dad went to the city public works department and said, if I dig the whole one block while you lay the line, and the city said okay. So it was the 1940s. People were still trying to extend our infrastructure. So where people lived was very compact because of the economy as well as the infrastructure that was around. And then one funny thing that we're talked about last night with City Hall is the 1894 flood. I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but just thinking that Pueblo trying to be modern and progressive. This is the old City Hall, and this is looking at Memorial Hall that says for sale. That's the lot where Memorial Hall sits on now. And so when they were going to build Memorial Hall, and they started talking about 1916, it was the oldest, most out-of-date building ever, and it was only 20 years old. And so, city governments never change. They always want nicer, newer buildings. But, this is an amazing building that we had as our old City Hall, but I think it had a lot of constraints. But this is, I'm guessing it's 1894 flood. It wasn't labeled, but it was an early flood. And so Pueblo had, been used to floods, even though they ended up building the City Hall right next to the river. And so we have a special guest that I'll talk about later, because I think she's shy, who's in the audience. But Will Stickney's great work was a couple building Colorado Springs and a couple other buildings here. He was Pueblo's most famous architect. And he designed, with Godley and Haskell from New York, City Hall, and that was built in 1917. And poor Pueblo, their first City Hall was built in 1889, and then the Progressive Era hit 3 years later, so it was completely outdated. And then this building was kind of Greek and eclectic revival and Roman revival, and it was finished in 1919. And the Progressive Era always is listed as ending in 1917. So we're always building buildings and finishing a couple years after, whatever the style is. But luckily this one I think is really timeless, especially Memorial Hall being opened last night is really just a beautiful, newly functional space. But so this would have been brand new, right on the river. It would have been shown, city government had just consolidated not too long ago, and it probably would have been one of the biggest projects the city government done. So investors and people in town would have seen the city, trying to do something, and that cupola would have been is going to be incredibly important as a sign of stability, I think, in the floodwaters. When you look down, you see City Hall still standing, and you see that cupola. That's incredibly important. And then the Progressive Era, I was always going to think of what would have been like for a kid, what would have been like somebody during the flood. Automobiles were really fairly new. By 1921, they'd been around for a little while, but automobiles, we kind of take that for granted. They would just been getting going. E-dealerships would have been opening places. These photos, aerial photos we have. We don't stop and think about the airplane was new. Here's during World War I. The Germans and the French started the airplanes, and here's the governor of Colorado with a biplane. And so these aerial photographs wouldn't have been possible, obviously, in the 1894 flood. Is that planes would have been brand new. So these planes, Pueblo already had a kind of a small airport, but these, in addition to dealing with the flood, these kids would have looked up and seen these planes, which have only been, 5-year-old technology. And you think about, the TV show you were watching 5 years ago. It's really not that long ago. And then this other one that I'm kind of a military historian, amateur, so this is the one that I always thought was really fascinating that I didn't know much about, is that they brought tanks to relieve Pueblo. And so you don't, especially in 1921, you don't think about tanks being rolling around the city, any city. And so in World War I, in 1917, they rolled out tanks, much larger versions, but they had these smaller kind of French Whipple tanks that were kind of get little smaller versions that could move around. And Patton actually worked on tanks in World War I, Eisenhower. And so they brought, the Army brought tanks to pull gear out because we didn't have massive tractors like we do now. And this is one, these are, Denver Public Library has a bunch of photos, and some of these photos are from this library. But here, there was at least 6 tanks that were brought because they're pulling boxcars. Because if you think about it, what Maria's going to show you these photos is just, really the city just flooded in on itself. And there were houses, there were boxcars that were all over town. And no matter how many people you conscripted to dig it out, you couldn't have done it without tanks. I'm just thinking of the, like an 8-year-old kid coming downtown to watch the relief efforts and hear these tanks rolling up and pulling things throughout the street. And, I think, even this presentation won't do justice to the flood. The Song of Pueblo is getting at it, but I think like Eric Larson or somebody needs to write a book about the Pueblo Flood and really kind of bring all of this together and kind of the tragedy and the drama and just the amazing time in history it was. And so, leading in from the tanks, the progressive era goes to about, starts to waver in the middle of the teens. The labor fights start to happen. Ludlow happens in 1914. That we're going to make this a better place really starts to get really rocky in the 1914s. And we're very close to the labor fights that happen. And then 1914 happens in August, and then there's World War I. And that really wasn't supposed to happen. Everybody was supposed to get along with this progressive, enlightened idea. And so it really kind of it made people stop. But America thought, okay, we're not involved. They'll deal with it themselves. And then this whole idea of technology had been put into planes and then put into automobiles and mass production of goods so we could have a middle class. And here you had, the machine gun had just mowed down thousands and thousands of people in World War I, and gas. So this slide shows, people are now developing, chemical weapons to shoot against each other. And I think there had just been something kind of like, something had gone wrong, watching this coverage of World War I. And so for the first couple of years, it probably would have been okay because Americans are okay if it's out of sight, out of mind. But we were soon, dragged into it. And America got in very late, and we helped win the war. But just in the short year that we were basically there, there was like 320,000 people, about over 100,000 people lost, another over 100,000 injured. And we were only there at the very tail end of this war. And it basically wiped out a generation in Europe. And so this would have been, it really weighed on Wilson, and it would have weighed on a lot of people that, things were not working out the way they thought when I started the presentation in 1904. And then, so we went to war, we won the war, we could still be exuberant, even though it was really painful. A lot of people from Pueblo died, were injured. And then during the end of the war, the pandemic hit, and the Spanish influenza hit. And so I'm trying to ramp you up for the flood. And so we just got out of World War I. There actually was war bond drives and rallies, and people had kind of warned and all over the, public health officials said, don't have these rallies. Thousands of people are going to come together, and everybody ignored them. They had these rallies. The flu actually spread worse. In Pueblo, everything was closed down. The schools were closed down from October to, I think, December 26th. So there was like this month and a half where like activity just stopped. At least 600 people died. And then I've talked to a couple people and said after the first of the year, they just called it pneumonia. And so you find a lot of people who suspiciously die of pneumonia after 1918 into 1919. And those were probably pandemic deaths as well, as people kind of came out and got back into society, was still filtering around. So This, almost more than anything, and we did a bunch of these historic surveys on the east side and the north side, and they really ravished the neighborhoods. We could watch people in 1917, this house is occupied by a family. The next year, it's occupied by a sister and her kid. And it's one thing that historians don't really put together when they're studying buildings is that the occupation of people changed so drastically from the flood. It just came in, and it cut across, a lot of the youngest survived and the oldest survived. It cut across all kind of the war-aged men and families. And Orphan Annie, there's the repercussions are that there was just a ton of parentless kids. And so this would have been actually incredibly horrible, I think, to deal with in Pueblo and in the nation. And it's really never talked about. It's kind of like Milan Kundera has this thing about like the book of laughter and forgetting. You either laugh about something or forget it. And it seems like the pandemic is one of the things that we just forgot about. Is after World War I, we won the war, don't talk about this. But this would have really affected Pueblo as well. And another thing, so 1919 rolls around, we won the war, we had a pandemic, we're getting better. 1919 is the Red Summer, and this is something that didn't happen in Pueblo, but it happened across the nation. And this is what really probably, we thought the war happened over there, pandemic, we can't really help that. A lot of black soldiers coming back from the war, the Great Migration, they came up, and there was basically these massive riots, race riots in 1919. And Chicago had some of the worst, and I can't even show you some of the slides, just Google it. And people were just killed and burned, and it was just really horrible race riots that happened in Chicago and 34 other cities. And so this idea that we're all going to get around with progressivism was really starting to crumble between the war, and then all of our, we tried to be sanitary, we had a pandemic, and now we had this horrible race riot, which really wasn't their fault anymore. It was us not being able to deal with these things. And so on top of that, I'm going to wrap up here, is that Maria helped me point out, I was so fixated in some of the history that in 1920, so there's a lot going on. Things are getting really heavy in Pueblo and all over the United States. It's not this idyllic, happy, historic period. Prohibition starts, so you can't even have a drink anymore. So 1920 rolls around, and she found this slide of this Union Tavern, and you notice a couple things. One, the guys don't look very happy anymore, and two, there's no alcohol anywhere. And I'm not going to say that the temperance movement, there was probably quite a few people who needed to not have as many drinks. But it started a whole new period was starting that would define the 20s was prohibition. And I think people kind of forget that that happened or what happened. So, here you have the pandemic, you have World War I, you have all these new technologies, you have the end of the progressive era, and now you can't have a drink. And so, when, in the beginning of June in 1921, Pueblo was a very different place, and I think people were struggling with a lot of different problems. And the other thing that Adam brought home to me talking to him yesterday was people would have been really, local governments, and even President Wilson really just looked feeble at the end of his presidency because people didn't have answers to these questions. They were really difficult questions on how to deal with this, and I think some of them we still deal with today. But so here's the setup of where the flood begins.
You have one more.
And one more. And and that was the other thing that really hit the United States, but hit Pueblo was all those people coming back flooded the market. We didn't know what to do with the labor market, so there was an incredible recession that was basically a depression in 1920. So on top of all that, there's economic dislocation, and Congress passes the Emergency Immigration Act in 1920-21, and it basically limits immigration numbers. So the one thing, you can go see your family in Italy, you can bring them over, Slovenians, and it was really aimed at Southern Europeans and everybody else except for Northern Europeans. And so now in addition, the one thing, as an immigrant, you think there's a better world, I can bring my family, I can work hard. Now there's race riots, there's labor riots, and now Congress tells us that you can only have a small percentage of the people that were here in 1910. So it would have been really difficult time for any immigrant, a child, a family trying to make it through Pueblo in 1921 when the flood hit. So I wanted to dispel, it was in a beautiful city, they were working hard, but there was a lot of things kind of floating out there that were very serious, and people, we think we live in an unsettling time now. Just imagine, all of that hitting your family. The flu would have been 3 years old at that point. You probably would have lost somebody or known somebody who had been lost. And it just been an incredibly unsettling time to be alive in Pueblo.
So this is a photo of the 1894 flood. This was the worst in Pueblo that had ever hit Pueblo. Just to give you some context of what had happened, there had been floods before the 1921 flood. So on June 3rd, it appeared to be a normal day. This was the Pueblo chieftain on June 3rd. no one knew, what the bad weather would soon hold and just how disastrous it would be for Pueblo and the Arkansas Valley. And that soon today it would be, on June 3rd, would experience Colorado's most devastating flood. So this newspaper article from the June 3rd edition of the Pueblo Chieftain begins to speak of the storms and minor flooding taking place. And the article states that the Pueblo police were warned to watch for high water in the Arkansas and Fountain Rivers. And so there was some sort of beginning stages of this bad weather and the warnings of what was to come. Many people didn't take heed, and they did not take the warnings very seriously. So an up-close of the article states that the heavy rains to the north of Pueblo have swollen the Arkansas and Fountain Rivers to within 1 foot of safety levees. And at 1:15 o'clock this morning, a cloudburst was reported at Bragdon Mine, north of Pueblo, on the Santa Fe Railroad. And later on, it says that that they went to check it out, but really was nothing unusual. Here's a photo of the swollen river. So another article talked about the large hailstones falling in Pueblo yesterday afternoon at 3:35 o'clock and continuing for a period of 25 minutes, followed by a heavy downpour of rain for a period of about 20 minutes, caused considerable damage to Pueblo greenhouses and truck gardens, in addition to stripping trees in city parks of part of their heavy leafing. Weather Bureau officers state that precipitation for the afternoon storm was 1.94 inches. A noticeable drop in temperature accompanied the heavy hailstorm. So everybody just thought it was a normal kind of weather storm that was taking place, and they mentioned later in the story that the damage from the hail, they're going to have to take a little while to assess what the damage would be. So I found this report from the U.S. Department of Agriculture that talked about the weather. So the climatological data report from 1921 stated, while there was no official Weather Bureau rainfall reporting stations in Pueblo at the time, well-authenticated records indicated that a total of 6 inches or more fell between June 2nd and June 5th. Although private citizens measured many of the reported rainfall amounts in tubs and buckets, a hard surface road leading through the practically level country, having been washed out, substantiates the level of erosion substantiated the measurements. So I thought that was interesting that people were measuring it in tubs and buckets and then reporting it to the Weather Bureau, and then they put it in this official government report. And here is the official report that shows that Pueblo had 7.14 inches of rain in the month of June. There was 1.94 on the 2nd, 1.64 on the 3rd, 1.45 on the 4th, and 1.12 on the 2nd. So these cloud bursts, as they said, were the cause. So what was this weather phenomenon? I looked at this report, and I am not a meteorologist, but I thought it was very interesting to see what caused this this weather phenomenon. And it said that the report states that the rainfall was due to the combined effort of an area of high barometric pressure that covered the northeastern Rocky Mountain slope by the morning of June 2nd, and an area of low pressure that developed about the same time over the Rocky Mountain Plateau included a western flow of air from the high up eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains, resulted in rapid condensation. So they termed that as cloudbursts, and this is what caused all that rain to fall all at one time. And here's an aerial photo, as Wade mentioned, of some of the rainfall and some of the river, starting to flood. And here's a picture of just one of the buildings. You can see how high the rain, the waters got. It was devastating. And Wade's going to talk from the city engineers. There's a map that shows how high the water level got. So Wade's going to talk about that in a little bit. So what we really have here to show you, to give you that feel of what it was like to be in that horrific experience, that catastrophe. I can't even imagine what it would have been like, but we have some archival film footage that we have a reel of archival footage. We used it to make one of these films for the InfoZone, but it was edited, and so what you're going to see is just the raw footage from the reel itself, and it shows you what what was going on in Pueblo, the fires, the devastation, and what it was like. So. So the entire Arkansas Valley from 30 miles west of Pueblo to the Colorado-Kansas state line was severely impacted by the flood. Hundreds of people died, and I've seen death toll estimates as high as 1,500, but most of them, they range from 98 to 250, 200 as the standard, but I really think that there could have been more because so many people were undocumented, missing, didn't have family to look for them, and they were washed away. And of course, the railroad, they sustained major damage. Railroad passenger cars and freight cars were swept away in every direction, and they were smashed. Fires broke out through the cities, as you see in the video. And the floodwaters also carried away entire buildings and businesses. So that you can see from that video just how devastating it was. So once the floodwaters receded, the immense damage became more visible. This is a photo. Can you imagine just trying to figure out a way to even clean this up? And the flood, which covered over 300 square miles, carried over 600 homes away and caused an estimated $25 million in damage at the time. In today's standards, I was trying to use the inflation calendar, it would be around $300 million or more in damage. Here's a photo of the Knuckles packing plant, which later became Alpha Beta. You can see just an awful mess. Another shot of Alpha Beta. Looks like there might have been some fire. The Arcade Hotel. This is just, look at all the mud and debris and boxcar in the middle of the road. So the Pueblo Chieftain put out a special flood extra on June 4th, and the publisher of the newspaper, the Star Journal, they went in and hand set the printing, the type on the press, and they hand printed editions because the need for news was so great to get the word out about all of the things. So it's just really interesting to look at this. It was a small edition. They printed it out by hand, and they tried to distribute it to as many people as possible. And then they talked about their special flood news service that that they had to print it by hand, and that they would try to get it to as many people as possible because the need for the news was great, and that they would restore regular service as soon as possible. Of course, after the flood, the roads became patrolled. The Pueblo was placed under martial law. A lot of people don't know that, and it came under federal control to restore law and order. Visitors to the city were not permitted. And then, in order to assist with the rescue efforts, the Red Cross set up refugee camps, and they were established to house and feed the people who were homeless because of the flood. So this article talks about a refugee camp set up on the south side. And it was established on the northern entrance of the Minnequa Works. And the military furnished the equipment, the Red Cross took care of supplies, and the Knights of Columbus provided the personnel. I found this Red Cross report in our archives, and we have recently digitized this, and we'll be adding it to our collection in case you want to read it. But it's very interesting because it talks about how many people did the Red Cross help, how much money was given, what their ethnic groups were. Just a really interesting report about how the Red Cross played a role in the relief activities. And so that will be online soon, and I'm going to talk about how you can get to these digital collections so that you can look at them at home or here at the library. Of course, health issues was a big problem with the flood because of all the dead animals, dead bodies, flies were around, and so this health bulletin said, destroy the flies. Flies will be our greatest source of epidemic danger. With all the dead bodies of small and large animals lying half buried in the debris of the flood, the flies will breed quickly and scatter disease from throughout the city. Kill every fly you find. Then it tells you to boil your water, and it tells you to bury or burn your garbage. They were trying to keep as much disease away from as possible. So that was one of the issues. So I found this interesting article. Wade had talked about prohibition being put in place, but the liquor restrictions were put in place, and June announcement was made by Frank Medina, Federal Prohibition Director of Colorado, that all liquor restrictions would be lifted for 30 days as an emergency measure combating the possible spread of disease in the flood area. And I can't tell you, when you see that mess and all the horror of it all, I think I would want to have a drink too. But Medina stated that 50 gallons of whiskey would be sent to Pueblo and additional shipments forwarded as needed. The plan from Washington provides for the administering of liquor to flood sufferers by workers under supervision of the permits. So the health workers had permits to have the liquor, and then they would distribute it. So I don't really know how that helped the health situation, but it was an article, and the Prohibition Director approved it. So I thought that was very interesting. And of course, searching for bodies. Many people, that was such a big part of the relief efforts, searching for bodies. Every day the chieftain would update the death toll, and at the McCarthy Funeral Home, they would update the morgue list, and so people would be searching for missing people. And I'd like to ask John Korber. He told me a very sad story today about his grandfather. Where are you, John? I'm going to take the microphone to him because it just really gives impact to the story of people looking for missing people and the searching for bodies and the recovery efforts. So John was good enough to say that he would tell me his first-hand story, well, second-hand.
Thank you. I'm sure others of you have family members who were here during the flood. My father was a fireman for the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad and was on one of the last trains to come in from the west. When he arrived in the railroad yards, there was about a foot of water up about to his knees, and he lived up at 168 Harvard, which at that time was known as 85 Block L. The river was not where it is now, so he could just walk right up through that area to the blocks area. When he got up there, my mother mentioned to him that there had been reports that we were going to have a flood, and he needed to go down and get his father and bring him up. His father had a little house at the corner of 3rd Street and Elizabeth. Well, my dad goes down there, tries to get him to come up, and he was a stubborn old German, and he wasn't about to leave his house. So he stayed there. His body was eventually found. You just saw a picture of prior furniture there with the whole corner out of the building. His body floated down from 3rd and Elizabeth, and they found it right in that corner. But the next time my father saw him, the George McCarthy Brown Funeral Home was located, I think, at 7th and Main Street, and they had bodies lined up around the corner, and my dad went up there. Henry McCarthy was working there. My dad could not recognize any of the bodies. He said, well, did your dad have a ring or something? Well, yes, he had a ring. So they started looking for the ring, and they eventually found him. That's the story.
Yes, you can applaud that. So stories like that that really put a personal touch to what happened on that June 3rd day, but it really gives some idea of how awful that must have been looking for loved ones. Here's a death list and a list of missing at Red Cross, so they would update this every day. But you can see that they put the ethnic groups and the race. So there's an unidentified Negro woman that was found. There was Mrs. Martina Galvin Maybird, 25 colored. There was a woman, Mexican, found in Wiley, age 40. So you can see that there were so many unidentified people that it is hard to put a number on that final death toll of how many people really did die. So a lot of people donated to the a lot of organizations donated to the Red Cross, and you can read about it, the Elks and the Lions and the Rotary Club and many, many people. But I found this little article that I had to put in because it says, children are alive to the work of relief, and this was in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Out near the University of New Mexico, a temporary refreshment stand made its appearance today. It's presided over half dozen children, the oldest of whom is about 10, and they sell cold drinks and peanuts to the passerby. What are you going to do with your profits? A patron inquired today. We are going to send them to the poor children of Pueblo, whose homes have been destroyed by the flood, was the reply. And I just thought that was such an interesting story to have in the newspaper, that a lemonade stand and these children wanted to give the profits to Pueblo. So I thought, you know, we hear about all of these other major donations in the Red Cross, but just a nice touch. And I went to the University of New Mexico, so I had to put that in. Here's another talk about the generous donations that were given to the relief efforts. And New York City businessmen, the New York Reserves, they donated $70,000. This article also talks about other contributions, about the contribution from Tulsa, Oklahoma, where they had recently suffered from race riots that Wade talked about. So they sent some money, and then one of the first donations that came in to support Pueblo was $2,000 from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which was destroyed by a flood more than 30 years ago from 1921, so the Great Johnstown Flood. So they gave $2,000 to Pueblo because they knew what that was like to go through a situation like that. And then time goes on, and they found another flood victim yesterday, which was July 1st. This was in the newspaper on July 1st. It had been 12 days since they found anybody. So an entire month just about had gone by and they were still finding bodies. So you can only imagine what that was like. Here is a picture of the federal building, the post office, and they're drying something out, and mailbags, that's what I thought, mailbags, and so I loved that picture. I thought that was really a neat picture. And then, of course, profiting from the flood, there were a lot of different sales going on, but I loved this one. Most of our washed goods were washed by the Arkansas, then they were rinsed in Lake Minnequaw and dried in the shade. So you'll see those throughout the Chieftain. If you come and look through our resources that we have here, you'll see ad upon ad of giant flood sale. They were trying to get rid of all the stuff that was damaged, I guess. And then here are some people selling postcards from the flood. So they were also selling postcards and films and trying to profit from the flood. I'm not sure the date of this photo, but I just thought that was kind of neat that they were selling postcards. This is one of the postcard, what it looked like. And then another postcard. And the back of a postcard so you can see what it looked like. And this one's very faint. You can't really see the name of who sent it, but I just thought I'd show you the back of those flood postcards, what they look like. So we talked about how there was prohibition and then there was relief from prohibition. And I think I could do a talk just entirely on the editorials that were taking place in the Pueblo Chieftain, because throughout it all, the Pueblo Chieftain really took a stance that Pueblo was going to rebuild, they were going to be better. They were, all the editorials were very positive. And so I found this editorial that I thought was really interesting because it talks about the splendid victory for medical sciences recorded in the history of Pueblo's flood period. It was talking about how great they were at not, contracting too many diseases and keeping people healthy during this time. But later on it says in the article that the restoration of Pueblo could not have progressed as it has in the past 3 weeks in the presence of alcohol. And there is strong reason to believe that alcohol would have promoted disorder and violence as well as interfered with good work. So I thought that was kind of interesting that they put that forward, that they're going to keep with the idea that alcohol would have made things a lot worse. Even though those 50 gallons of whiskey came in, so somebody had those. And then on July 3rd, I just wanted to kind of end on a more positive note. Pueblo started to find some normalcy again. And so the Majestic Theater opened vaudeville on July 3rd, and there were also articles about big celebrations at Minnequaw Lake for the 4th of July. So there was some idea that some normalcy is coming back to Pueblo, and we'll have to stay tuned for part 2 to talk more about the more recovery effort and how long it took to rebuild, right, Wade? Wade will do that one. And I talked about our digital collections because this was a self-serving promotion, but we are working on digitizing our historic photo collection here at Rawlings Library. And you can look at these flood photos up close and personal by going to our website. And we have many of the flood photos that I've shown tonight, and we are also digitizing more. We have hundreds more in our collection that I would like to add. And so you can go where we have an internet connection and search these collections. It's the Southern Colorado Water Trails collection. It's a compilation of 700 photographs that relate to water history in this area. So there's the flood, there's the building of the levees after the flood, there's the Frying Pan, Arkansas project story. So that's just one of the collections. We also have added other collections, WPA photographs, Kit Carson's will, Pueblo Then and Now, and we'll be adding more and more, Dr. Corwin's scrapbook, so we'll be adding more collections throughout the year and the next few years. So please do visit that. If you go to the library website, just click search digital collection and you can look at those flood photos, you can save them, you can print them, you can share them on Facebook and tell other people to visit. And this is a map that we took, and it is from our archival collection on the 3rd floor here. And somebody drew the boundaries of where the floodwaters went, and so I just wanted to point that out, that we do have these types of maps that you can also look at. And then Wade's going to talk about this 1921 flood in downtown Pueblo map, GIS map, and a city engineering drawing.
Yeah, just to wrap up, it wasn't the largest area through our city, but it was where all of our commercial life was occurring. And so, get up here. Oh, this is like an angled thing. That's not going to happen. Get a laser pointer. But if you could see, there's kind of a big roof in there. That's the historic Arkansas Riverwalk. This is all kind of Union Avenue in between there. And there's this abrupt line. So everybody in the Mesa Junction, if you would have stayed at home in the Mesa Junction, you would have been just looking down at this devastation. And I wish, in addition to that video, that there was one from somebody in Mesa Junction just looking down. It would have been, I mean, it's always a beautiful view, but just to watch the whole town wash away. And then, there's a lot of famous photos from Goat Hill, called Tenderfoot Hill back then, some places, looking straight down. And so if you could get away, there was an abrupt escape route. But it's flooded all the way up until about the Thatcher building, where the flood levels were going down. And the next thing I was going to show you is some of our old city records are not archived as well as I would like them to be. And so we're going to try to get a grant and work with BHS or the library and try to get some of those archived. And when I was going through some records in the basement of City Hall before it got renovated, I found this record just kind of rolled up with all the other records on your cross sections of streets and incredibly boring stuff. And I said, whoa, 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 whoa. We need to pull that out, we need to bring that out and scan it and put it in kind of the important fireproof vault, and we need to talk to somebody about this getting scanned. And so Maria, if you want to zoom in maybe on the left side first. This is the city crews. They had a great engineering, they didn't have a planning department back in the 20s, but they had a great engineering department that did a lot of great maps. W.M. Peach was a city engineer for a number of years who lived up on the north side. And so city crews went out and mapped flood depths. And so by, I think this is the middle of June, they had a cross section, and you can see it's very, it's an engineer. I don't think this map ever got out anywhere. And so zoom in a little bit more and a little bit farther down.
Let's see.
But it's a cross section, and for those of you guys who are, geologists or architects or engineers, they drew a line through from Union Avenue, from where the Arkansas is now. There it is. So there's the kind of viaduct, and so there's the water line. And so you scroll over to the right, and it shows where the water was in the Holmes Hardware building. And there's a bunch of incredible photos of radiators outside the Holmes Hardware building. And then you scroll, this is where, see that stuff right there? The bottom little puddle there, that's where the river normally was. And so that line is where the river was at where the Harp is now today. And so then you go across, and I'm sorry, it's hard to, we're going to zoom in and pull these out later, but it shows buildings that are gone as well as buildings that are here, the flood level down through. So this is right where Union Avenue would have been, and I believe the highest, it went from 10 feet, I think 14 feet, I don't know, John or Susan, is about the highest that was recorded, and that's a pretty serious flood. You had to have a two-story building to escape this. And so then you go up and you see Tenderfoot Hill or Goat Hill coming up there. And then the second part is downtown. And I don't know if you want to zoom in the very far end of it. I think it ends up being 6th Street or something. So this is some of the best evidence I've seen of kind of how far north the flood went. I think some pictures and some of the other maps are pretty good, but I'd never seen this source of, how far did the flood reach. So by there it was very low, but you could see that it went all the way up to about where the Thatcher building is now. And so, the other thing I wanted to do this for is because people are so proud of the flood in Pueblo and not being native born. I always thought it was really strange that people were very proud of this thing that wiped them out. And I think doing this presentation, and then I asked Adam yesterday, and Adam's our architectural consultant, he owns a hotel in Pennsylvania, and I said, the thing that almost made me cry was the story from Johnstown, and they have the worst loss of death anywhere. The worst flood in American history is in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. So to see that, this was really the Katrina of the day. I mean, they talk about this in the New York newspapers, Philadelphia, Chicago, and they never say Pueblo, Colorado. They just say Pueblo. We were such a big city that they would just refer to us by name. And so for Johnstown to send some of the first money was really important. And I asked Adam, I said, is Johnstown this proud of their flood? He said, oh my God, Wade, they love their flood. They had 3 floods, and they mark each level on every single building, and they have shirts. And I think what I kind of realized by doing this was that I was Debbie Downer part of the presentation, but the flood was, I think, one of the times when all those things that Puebloans were working towards were falling apart. Was one time when everybody kind of came together and showed what they were made out of. And so I think that's really why you see pictures at Dewdrop and downtown and any restaurant. It's not the loss of life. It was that we were hit by some of the worst calamities in American history, and they rebuilt, without FEMA. The Army was here, I think, for 6 months, and they left, and it was the fortitude of the business community. And then by you don't see any houses, very few houses built between 1920 and 1924, but by 1924, the Roaring Twenties was starting to catch up with Pueblo, and you see this boom. But really, Union Avenue it switches to Main Street. And Union Avenue into the 30s, pictures look like these things were still really run down. So I think part kind of all hit me while we were doing this. That progressive idea that we could really help each other and make a better world kind of had faltered. And it wasn't until they had this calamity that really America and Pueblo came together and basically built their way out of something so incredibly horrific that cities today might even give up. So thank you guys. And we'll take any questions or comments that you guys have.